My name is Miriam Cole, and I am 33 years old. And the Wednesday afternoon, a locksmith drilled open my grandmother's safe in the back of a closet in the house on Clemson Street is the Wednesday afternoon I finally understood why I had spent my entire life feeling like someone standing slightly outside the family circle. I want to start with the safe before I start with anything else, because the safe is the center of this story, in the way that physical objects sometimes become the centers of stories, not because of what they are, but because of what they contain and how long they waited. My grandmother Eleanor died 30 years ago. She died when I was 3 years old. And what I know of her, I know from photographs and from the specific way people's voices change when they talk about someone they loved completely, and the way my mother's voice changed specifically when Eleanor's name came up, was the sound of a woman who had loved her mother entirely and missed her entirely and had not fully finished grieving her even 30 years later. The safe had been part of Eleanor's inventory when the estate was handled. Her attorney had mentioned it. The family had said they would have it opened. Then the estate closed, and the safe was still locked, and the family had moved it to the back of a closet in the house that my uncle had taken over, and it had sat there through 2 subsequent renovations and 1 change of carpet, and approximately 30 years of family life, in which it occasionally came up in conversation as a thing that should probably be dealt with at some point. My Aunt Renata decided to renovate the house this past spring, not a cosmetic renovation, a structural one. New floors, reconfigured closets, the kind of project that requires clearing out everything that has accumulated in the spaces people stop looking at. The safe was in one of those spaces. It could not be worked around. Something had to be done about it. A locksmith was called. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon in April. He assessed the safe, determined it would need to be drilled, and completed the work in 45 minutes with 3 family members present, my Aunt Renata, my cousin James, and me, who had driven 2 hours that morning because Renata had called the previous night and mentioned in passing that they were finally opening Eleanor's safe, and something in me had decided that I needed to be there. The locksmith removed the drill and stood back and opened the door. Inside the safe were 4 things: a manila folder containing a property transfer document, a sealed white envelope with the word letter written on it in my grandmother's handwriting, a photograph, and a smaller sealed envelope addressed specifically to Miriam in the same handwriting, 30 years old. My aunt and my cousin both looked at the envelope with my name on it for a moment without speaking. Then Renata handed it to me. I need to tell you what the safe contained before I tell you what it changed, because the contents are the story, and I want to tell them accurately rather than building toward them dramatically. The property transfer document was a deed amendment for a small property in western North Carolina that my grandmother had owned separately from the Clemson Street house. A 2-acre parcel with a cabin that she had purchased in the 1970s and maintained independently for 20 years. The amendment was dated 2 years before her death and transferred the parcel directly to me, to Miriam Eleanor Cole, by name, with a notation indicating the transfer was to take effect upon my grandmother's death. I was 3 years old when she filed that amendment. She had transferred a property to a 3-year-old and secured the document in a safe that she apparently expected someone would eventually open. My aunt looked at the transfer document for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "We did not know about the North Carolina property." James said, "Was it in the estate?" Renata said, "Not that I saw." She was looking at the document with the expression of someone recalibrating multiple things simultaneously. The property had not been in the estate inventory. It had already been transferred. It had bypassed probate entirely because it was not part of Eleanor's estate at death. It was already mine, had been mine since I was 3, and I had not known because nobody had known, because the document was in a safe that had not been opened for 30 years. The photograph was of Eleanor and me. I was approximately 2 years old in it, sitting in her lap in a chair on what appeared to be a porch. She was looking at the camera. I was looking at her. On the back of the photograph, in her handwriting, was one sentence: "She knows where she comes from." I have looked at that sentence many times since Wednesday, and I understand it differently each time. The letter in the sealed white envelope was addressed to the family generally. Eleanor had written it in the year before her death. It was 2 pages, careful handwriting, organized thoughts. She explained the property transfer. She explained why she had done it the way she had done it, through the safe rather than through open family communication. She wrote that she had loved her children, but that she had also known them well enough to understand that an open transfer would have produced conflict that she did not believe Miriam should have to navigate. She wrote that she had understood, even when Miriam was very small, that Miriam was the one in the family who would need something of her own more than the others. She wrote, "I am putting this here because I know someone will eventually open the safe. I trust that the right person will be present when it happens." Then, I opened the small envelope with my name on it. The letter addressed to me specifically was 4 pages. Eleanor had written it over several evenings in the year before she died, based on the dates she referenced throughout. She had written it to a person who was not yet old enough to read it, which gave the letter a specific quality, the quality of something written for the future rather than for the present, for the Miriam she believed would eventually exist, rather than the Miriam who was 2 years old at the time. She started by introducing herself, not as a grandmother, but as Eleanor, a woman who had grown up in Tennessee, who had moved north at 22, and had built a life that she was proud of in most ways and regretful of in specific others. She introduced herself as someone who had watched families operate across decades and had developed clear views about what families did well and what they did badly, and what the costs of the bad things were to the specific people who paid them. She wrote about the family with the kind of honesty that people achieve when they know the document will not be read until they are gone and cannot be argued with. She wrote that her daughter, my mother, was a kind woman who had organized her love around the path of least resistance, and that the path of least resistance in their family had not always been the path that served everyone equally. She wrote specific things about specific patterns and specific people that I am going to keep private because they belong to me and to Eleanor and not to this story. What I will share is the paragraph that addressed me directly, the reason she had built the safe into her plans at all. She wrote, "I have watched you since the day you were born, Miriam, and I know 3 things about you that I want you to have in writing. First, you are not the problem. Second, you see clearly what others in this family have decided not to see, and that clarity is a gift, even when it feels like a burden. Third, you deserve something that is yours and yours alone, and that no family dynamic can complicate. I have tried to provide that. The North Carolina property is paid off. There is a small maintenance account attached to the deed. It will be there when you find this." I read that paragraph 3 times in the closet doorway. My Aunt Renata was nearby organizing something. My cousin James was on his phone. Neither of them was paying attention to me. I stood there with my grandmother's letter in my hands, 30 years old, written for a person who was 2 at the time, and I thought about every family gathering where I had felt slightly outside the circle, every holiday where I had watched love move in patterns that did not include me equally, every time I had told myself I was imagining it, and every time I had suspected I was not imagining it. Eleanor had seen it 30 years ago. She had seen it clearly enough to put a property in a safe and write me a letter and trust that someone would eventually open the door. The conversation with Renata and James happened that evening, after the locksmith left and after I had read the letter twice and had a glass of water and sat in Eliver's kitchen, which Renata had not yet renovated, and organized myself for what was coming. Renata asked what the letter said. I told her I would share the parts that were relevant to the family and keep the parts that were personal. She said, "Was there anything about the property in it?" I said, "Yes." She said, "The North Carolina property?" I said, "Yes." She said, "We did not know your grandmother owned land up there." I said, "I know." I showed her the property transfer document. She read it carefully. She showed it to James. He read it carefully. There was a specific silence that settled in after they both finished reading, the silence of people who are processing information that has arrived in a form that does not allow for easy revision. Renata said, "This was never in the estate?" I said, "The transfer predated her death. It was not part of the estate because she had already transferred it." Renata said, "To a 3-year-old?" I said, "To me specifically, by name, witnessed and notarized and recorded with the county 2 years before she died." James asked the practical question that James always asks, because James is practical in the way that some people are practical, as a first response to everything. He said, "Do you know what the property is worth now?" I said, "I had not looked." He said, "I can look." I said, "You can look." He pulled out his phone. The figure he found was not a fortune, but it was significant. A 2-acre parcel with an original cabin in western North Carolina that had been maintained through a small attached account and had appreciated across 30 years of real estate activity in that region. James said the number out loud. Renata looked at the wall. Neither of them said anything immediately. I said, "I want to be clear about something." I said, "I am not bringing this to the family as a dispute. This is a documented transfer, and the documentation is valid, and I have already confirmed that with an attorney by phone this afternoon." I said, "I am sharing the information because Eleanor clearly wanted it shared. She put it in the safe with a family letter, not just a letter to me." I said, "The question I want to talk about is not what I do with the property, but what we do with the information in the letter, the information about how this family operated and how Eleanor saw it, and what she wanted to say while she still could." Renata was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What did she say?" I said, "Do you want the full version?" She said, "Yes." I said, "It is going to be hard to hear." She said, "I am 61 years old, Miriam. I can handle hard to hear." I read her the relevant portions, the ones about patterns, the ones about costs, the ones about the path of least resistance. Renata listened without interrupting. When I finished, she looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, "Your grandmother was the most honest person I have ever known." I said, "I am beginning to understand that." The North Carolina property is mine. I drove up to see it 3 weeks after the safe was opened. The cabin was smaller than I expected and exactly right. Eleanor had maintained it well through the account she had set up. The roof was sound, the porch was intact, the inside was clean and dusty in the specific way of a place that has been tended to but not occupied. I sat on the porch for the better part of an afternoon. The property sat at the edge of a small meadow with trees on 3 sides and a view of a ridge to the west. Eleanor had bought it in the 1970s with money she had saved independently, and had kept it independently, and had decided when I was born that it was the right thing to leave to me, specifically. She had seen something in me at 2 years old that she had not seen elsewhere in the family. I do not know what she saw exactly. I know what she wrote, that I was the one who would need something of her own more than the others. I have thought about that sentence many times. I think she meant that she saw the position I would occupy in the family and understood that position would cost me something, and that the cost should be met with a gift that was proportional to it. A property is not an apology. It is not compensation for 30 years of standing slightly outside the circle. It is something else, something more deliberate than an apology, a provision. Eleanor providing for a cost she could see coming before I was old enough to understand what it was. My mother called after Renata told her about the safe. Her voice was the voice of someone who has received information and has been sitting with it and has not finished sitting with it and is calling anyway because the sitting had become too much. She said, "Did you read the whole letter?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Your grandmother was always able to see things the rest of us couldn't." I said, "I think she saw things the rest of us chose not to." My mother was quiet. Then she said, "That's fair." She said it simply, and I received it simply. We have been talking more since April, not about the property specifically, about Eleanor, about what Eleanor observed and what the family had decided collectively to not examine, and what the cost of that decision had been across 30 years, and who had paid it. My mother has said things in those conversations that I have never heard her say before. Honest things, the kind that take 30 years of accumulated information to arrive at. I have said things back, also honest. We are not fixed. I do not believe we will be fixed in any clean sense, but we are more accurately known to each other than we have ever been, and accurate knowing is where repair becomes possible. Eleanor knew that. She put a letter in a safe and waited 30 years for someone to open it. And when they did, the right person was present. She trusted that would happen. She was right. I have kept the photograph. It sits on my desk. Eleanor and me on a porch. Me looking at her, her looking at the camera. She knows where she comes from. I am learning, 30 years later, exactly what she meant. Drop your city in the comments. Hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.